Across the systems of the mid-sector rim, she was spoken of with the reverence usually reserved for deities or death. Saraphene, daughter of the High Tempests, warrior of the Obsidian Moons, last heir to the Veronic throne. But titles were often unnecessary. Most knew her simply as the Storm. She possessed lightning in her blood and fury in her veins, and every man who had dared to court her had left with broken bones or shattered pride, if they left at all. Veron was a planet shrouded in obsidian sand and electrical storms, and Seraphine ruled it not from a throne but from the heart of its fury. Her presence was legendary. Alien generals from neighboring systems dispatched envoys draped in velvet and flattery only to rescind their offers with trembling apologies after a single encounter. She was deemed too dangerous, too unpredictable, too much even for her own people. The male suitors who sought her hand for power rather than affection quickly disappeared from the courts, some vanishing altogether. There was no crime, no decree, only Seraphine's silence, her glacial gaze, and the stark certainty that no one stood beside her unless she permitted it. Many concluded she was cursed, others whispered she was heartless, but none truly grasped that she was simply weary, weary of being feared, weary of being manipulated, weary of never encountering honesty or strength without malice. And then, as fate would have it, a ship descended from the sky. It wasn't large, not a warship, not even a diplomatic skimmer, just a single-person drop pod streaking across the atmosphere like a misplaced meteor. It crashed into the outer cliffs beyond the black dunes, where the storms were thickest and the ground most unstable. Ordinarily, the Veronic patrols would have disregarded it or allowed the winds to tear it apart, but the signal from the wreckage carried something peculiar, human. No one had seen a Terran in Veron space in decades. Seraphine went herself, not because of the crash or the species, but because the winds whispered differently that night. The storm had shifted in its rhythm. Something had entered her world that was unlike the others, and in her heart something long dormant flickered. He crawled from the wreckage, bleeding and covered in ash. One leg was stiff with pain, the other trembled under the weight of his exogear. The drop pod still smoked behind him, its side panels crushed from impact. The wind tore at his jacket, and the sand was already consuming what remained of his crash site. But he didn't panic. He stood despite his wounds, his helmet under one arm, face turned up toward the gathering storm. Lieutenant Carter Hol had seen worse. He'd survived 3 campaigns along the Elteron front and walked away from the siege of Kion Prime. A broken pod and an unfamiliar planet didn't faze him, at least not yet. What did give him pause, however, was the figure that emerged from the storm as if conjured by the gods. She was taller than any woman he'd ever seen, armored in plates that shimmered with residual lightning, her long silver-black hair flowing in the wind like a battle banner. Her eyes glowed faintly, not with technology, but with something older, elemental. She didn't speak as she approached. She didn't need to. Most men would have fallen to their knees. Carter only tilted his head. "You the welcoming committee?" he asked, wiping blood from his brow. The Veronic guards at her flank stiffened. One even raised his weapon, but Seraphine lifted a single finger and all movement ceased. She studied him, this man who stood under her storm and did not bow. His expression was calm, curious, not arrogant but unfazed. Her power washed over him like thunder, and yet he stood steady. "You are human," she stated. "Last time I checked," he replied, straightening. "Name's Carter Hol. I seem to have landed in the middle of one hell of a weather report. You crashed in a restricted territory of a sovereign world. Figured that out after the sky tried to electrocute me." There was no mockery in his voice, just dry humor and a calm acceptance of his situation. She stepped closer. The sand crackled beneath her feet. The static in the air grew sharp. "You are not afraid of me," she said, more observation than question. Carter looked her dead in the eye. "Should I be?" And for the first time in years, perhaps for the first time in her life, Seraphine did not know how to answer because no one had ever asked her that before, not without trembling, not without pretense, and certainly not while smiling. Carter was taken not to a prison cell but to the Citadel. That alone raised eyebrows across the Veronic court. It was unheard of. Strangers weren't brought to the Queen's fortress, especially not male strangers. Word spread like wildfire. Some believed he was to be executed in public for trespassing. Others, more skeptical, whispered of interrogation by lightning or dissection by soul splitters. But none of that happened. Instead, Saraphene ordered a place to be prepared at her table. He arrived in borrowed Veronic garb, stitched in colors that didn't suit him, the high collar making his shoulders itch. But he walked tall, unbothered, and when he entered the main hall of the Storm Citadel, he didn't stare at the pillars of black glass or the floating orbs of captured lightning humming above their heads. He looked directly at her. She watched from her throne, poised but silent, one leg crossed over the other, a ceremonial blade resting beside her. Her court waited for the Queen to speak. Carter nodded slightly. "Didn't expect dinner," he said. "Appreciate it." No one laughed. The guard shifted uneasily. Courtiers murmured behind jeweled fans and long sleeves. No one addressed her so plainly. Saraphene raised a hand, silencing the room with a gesture. "You were a soldier," she said. "I still am." "Then you know what it means to kill." He didn't flinch. "More than I care to." A beat passed. The storm outside struck the tower walls with distant thunder, and somewhere overhead, light flickered through the dome's crystal glass. "I do not dine with cowards," she said. "Good," Carter replied. "Neither do I." And the room froze. The Queen's mouth curved, not quite a smile, but something close to it. She gestured to the seat beside her, a place reserved for warlords or heirs. Carter didn't hesitate. He sat. The banquet unfolded with tense curiosity. The ironic dishes were placed before him, foods that sparked and shimmered, liquids that whispered against the skin. He ate without complaint, without flinching, even when one of the dishes bit him back. Saraphene watched him closely, asking occasional questions about Terran culture, military hierarchy, the shape of Earth's oceans. He answered plainly, never embellishing, never groveling. He was the first man who didn't flinch when she leaned close, the first who didn't stumble over his words when she asked about war. He didn't treat her like a monster. He treated her like a soldier, and it shook her in ways she didn't understand. When the feast ended and the hall cleared, she stood beside him beneath the arch of lightning-crowned windows. "You are different," she said. "Maybe," he replied. "But I think you've been lied to a lot." "And you won't?" "I don't need to." She looked at him for a long moment, her breath calm, her thoughts unreadable. "You're not afraid of my blade. I've seen worse things than metal. I am not made of kindness. I never asked for that." The wind rose outside, and the Queen of Storms, for the first time in her life, realized she was curious, not about his origin or his scars or the crash that brought him to her world, but about what kind of man stood before her without fear, yet with no intention to conquer. A man who looked at her and saw a woman, not a throne, not a weapon, a woman. The following morning, Carter awoke in a guest chamber layered with walls of obsidian and silk, as if designed by the galaxy's most conflicted architect. The bed had no corners, the windows opened to nothing but sky. There were no guards at his door, no chains on his wrists. He found it unnerving. When he wandered into the lower courtyard, following the scent of smoke and metal, he stumbled upon Saraphene training. Alone, her blade was not ceremonial now. It moved with deadly grace, cutting air, slicing through the heavy fog like a dance written in blood and breath. Her motions were precise, coiled with restraint, every strike a contained storm. She saw him watching but didn't stop. Carter folded his arms and leaned against a pillar. He didn't speak, he just watched. The silence stretched. Most would have spoken, complimented her form, asked questions, tried to impress. Carter said nothing. When she finally finished, her chest rising with exertion, she walked past him, resting the blade on her shoulder. "You do not speak. You didn't ask anything." "Most men do not wait for permission," he smiled faintly. "Most men aren't trying to live through the day." She considered him. Would you spar? I don't think I'd win. But would you run? No. She tossed him a practice blade. He caught it one-handed. The duel was fast, furious, and short. She disarmed him within the first two exchanges, not because he was weak, he was fast, his instincts sharp, but because she moved like lightning, and lightning could not be blocked. He lay on the stone floor panting. She stood above him, her blade pointed down. You're smiling, she said. You fight like you've been waiting for someone to show up, and you fight like someone who doesn't mind losing. He grinned up at her. I've found that sometimes losing tells you what's worth fighting for. Saraphene stared at him. Then, for the first time since her reign began, she laughed. It wasn't cruel or scornful. It was low, clear, and warm, like distant thunder rolling over mountains. And in that moment, the wind around her calmed as if the storm, too, had finally found something to listen to. The court grew restless. It began with the nobles, sharp-eyed, soft-handed creatures who had long grown used to the queen's impenetrable solitude. They met in velvet-draped corners, whispering behind gilded masks and ceremonial fans, their voices low but sharp as obsidian blades. They didn't say his name aloud, but everyone knew who they spoke of. The Terran who walked beside Saraphene without flinching, the human with no title, no house, no throne, only a soldier's scars and a stare that didn't break when hers turned stormy. They called him an anomaly, a disruption, a danger to the order they had carefully constructed around her isolation. Saraphene heard the rumors. She heard everything in her citadel. But she did not stop Carter from walking beside her. She invited him to the War Council. He stood behind her while generals debated resource allocations and border skirmishes. When he spoke, it was brief, tactical, precise, devoid of ego. He did not try to take control. He offered insight. He corrected a misreading of Terran fleet maneuvers that saved half a sector of patrols from ambush. The generals listened, begrudging at first, then with quiet respect. Still, the whispers deepened. They said she was weakening, softening. They were wrong. Saraphene was becoming something far more dangerous, aware. She stood in her chambers one night, looking out across the storm-wreathed cliffs, her eyes reflecting the lightning in the sky. Carter stood beside her, arms crossed, watching the horizon. You know they don't like that I keep you close, she said. He nodded. They want you alone. You're easier to worship from a distance. She turned to him. And what do you want? He didn't hesitate. To stand beside you, not behind you. That answer should not have mattered so much, but it did. She stepped closer, searching his face. What if I gave you power? I didn't come for power. Then why did you stay? He met her gaze with quiet certainty. Because you didn't ask me to be afraid. Outside, thunder cracked the night open. Inside, something gentler took root. And for the first time in her life, Saraphene wondered what it might feel like to be known not as a legend, but as a woman with a name and a heart that had long been silenced by fear. The attack came just before dawn. A faction of the outer houses, emboldened by whispers and woven lies, launched a sudden strike on the citadel's southern gate. They brought cloaked vessels and weapons laced with anti-energy fields, old war relics meant to disrupt her stormcraft. They wanted to depose her, to claim that the queen had been compromised, softened by Terran influence. 1,000 warriors stormed the cliffs. Explosions echoed through the obsidian towers. Sirens howled. Saraphene met them head-on. Carter was already at her side, sword drawn, pulse steady. The moment they stepped onto the battlefield, lightning split the clouds in response. Her presence flared like a second sun, but the invaders had come prepared. Their field emitters sparked, casting a dome around the battlefield, dulling the electric threads that danced across her skin. Her power stuttered. They rushed her. Carter moved first. He met the front line with brutal efficiency, a dance of steel and instinct. He wasn't like her royal guards, graceful, precise, elegant. He was raw, blunt, untamed. He fought like someone who had nothing left to prove and everything left to protect. Saraphene watched him carve a path through chaos, buying her seconds. Second, she needed to summon what remained of her strength to focus the storm inside her, not through the air, but through herself. She leapt into the fray. Her fist crackled with thunder, her blade cut through field armor like fire through ice. Carter met her rhythm without faltering, the two of them moving in sync as if war had written them into the same sentence. By sunrise, the rebellion had collapsed. The surviving traitors were dragged before the throne, bound and beaten, their armor scorched. The court watched in breathless silence as Saraphene stood over them, not with fury, but with clarity. "You do not fear me," she said. "You fear what I might become if I stop being alone." Carter stepped beside her. She did not wave him back. She let the court see him, not as a weakness, but as her sword, her stormbreaker. Later, alone in the quiet of her private chamber, Saraphene sat beside the window, her arms streaked with bruises, her breath slow and shallow. Carter entered without knocking, blood on his cheek and dust in his hair. "You saved me," she said. He knelt before her. "You didn't need saving." She touched his face. "No," she whispered, "but I needed someone who wouldn't fear standing with me." And for the first time, Seraphine leaned forward, not as a queen, not as a warrior, but as a woman whose heart had never been touched without trembling. She kissed him. The storm outside quieted. The storm within her did not. The citadel walls had grown silent, not from fear, but from a different kind of reverence. The guards bowed with deeper focus. The nobles watched with new restraint. The storm, for all its fury, had settled in the eyes of the one who ruled it. And in that stillness, Saraphene walked beside Carter like a woman learning the shape of peace. It was strange, stranger than war. In her youth, she had been shaped by ritual and rage, trained to channel the volatile energy of Varen into power no man could match. Affection had always been weakness. Trust was the first ingredient in betrayal. She had built walls as high as her towers, and yet somehow Carter had walked through them without a weapon in hand. She found herself watching him when he wasn't looking, how he moved with awareness but never with calculation, how he spoke with honesty that wasn't polished into diplomacy. She liked that he didn't reach for her when he thought she needed comfort. He just stood there, solid and quiet, letting her choose when to lean on him. On the third night after the rebellion, she took him to the ruins of Ys, a place none were allowed, the buried temple where the first Veronic kings once pledged themselves to the storm. The wind there was older than memory, and the stone bore carvings even she could not read. He said nothing as they walked. She didn't speak until they stood before the sealed monument. Its surface pulsed faintly, not with magic but with history. "This is where I became queen," she said. "Not by inheritance, not by ceremony. I stood here when the storm tested me, and I passed." He ran his fingers across the stone. "How?" "I didn't flinch." She looked at him then. "But I didn't feel anything either. I was still cold, unshaken. That's what they wanted me to be. That's how I survived." Carter looked back at her. "And now?" She hesitated, then softly, "Now I want to feel. And I'm terrified of what that makes me." He stepped forward, placing one hand gently against her cheek. "It makes you alive." She didn't move away. The wind swirled around them, not in fury, but like a sigh through ancient halls. She leaned into his touch, and for the first time since she took the throne, Seraphine allowed herself to close her eyes without fear. The announcement came quietly. No fanfare, no decree, just a quiet gesture. Carter standing beside her throne, no longer behind it during the annual festival of Veyron's renewal. His presence there spoke volumes. He was no longer a guest, no longer a curiosity. He was hers, and she, unspoken but clear, was his. There were no formal words for what they had. The Veronic language had many ways to describe power, dominion, lineage, but not many for love. That word was whispered in old songs, left for the stars and the wind, but the people saw it in how she looked at him when he wasn't speaking, in how his hand hovered near hers, not out of possessiveness, but out of knowing she could reach for it any time and that he would never pull away. The court shifted, the nobles murmured, but the rebellion had burned away their boldness. None dared to challenge the bond they witnessed growing day by day. That night, in the garden of molten flowers, Saraphene walked barefoot across the warm, glassy ground, her long cloak trailing behind her. Carter followed, watching the way the night embraced her like a secret. "Do you ever miss your world?" she asked, not turning around. "Sometimes," he answered. "Honestly, but not enough to leave." She looked back. "And if Earth called you home?" "I've already found it." The glow of the flowers lit her face in soft hues. She approached him slowly, stopping with only a breath between them. "I've ruled without equal," she said. "I've killed without regret. I've carried nations on my shoulders and crushed uprisings with my hands, but I've never let someone in, not like this." "Then let me stay," he said. "Not to take anything, just to be the one who doesn't leave." She placed his hand against her heart. "You were never afraid," she whispered. "No," he said, "but I never expected to care this much." Their foreheads touched, and in the quiet, Seraphine understood that storms could do more than destroy. They could also cleanse, they could also create. And in that moment between wind and warmth, between power and presence, she let herself fall, not from grace, not from strength, but into something far older, far deeper. She let herself fall in love. The war came at dawn, not from rebels within her realm, but from beyond Veyron's stars, an old alliance that had once courted her, then turned cold when she refused to bend. They returned, not with gifts this time, but with warships and dreadnoughts, claiming that Seraphine's bond with the Terran was proof she had grown weak, emotional, unpredictable. She stood atop the citadel, cloaked in steel, her blade resting on her shoulder. Lightning coiled in the sky like a crown. Carter stood beside her, quiet as always, scanning the horizon where the enemy's descent turned the morning sky red. "You don't have to fight this time," he said softly. "I do," she replied. "But not for my throne, for them and for you," he nodded. "Then I'll be beside you." "No," she said, facing him fully. "This time I need you to live, not as my blade, but as my future." She kissed him, slow and sure, tasting the storm she'd once wielded as armor. Then she turned away, stepped off the edge of the balcony, and summoned the wind. The battle was unlike any her people had seen in generations. She met the enemy in the air, moving like a streak of fire and thunder, her voice a war cry that bent the clouds. Energy shields cracked, cannons howled, the city's defenses roared to life. However, the attacking forces were well prepared. They carried planetary disruptors, gravity spikes, instruments of destruction crafted in secrecy, far from the reach of her informants. At the third hour, a concentrated beam of collapsed matter impacted the west spire. The resulting explosion consumed half of the citadel wall. Carter dashed into the inferno. Guards attempted to restrain him, shouting warnings. Debris rained down, yet he pressed forward into the ruins, calling out her name, battling through flames and smoke until he reached the shattered edge of the tower. She was there, trapped under stone and metal, her body seared, her breathing shallow. For the first time, he witnessed her bleed, and it shattered him. He knelt beside her, cradling her head, his hands trembling. "You're going to be fine," he said, even as blood stained his palms. "I've got you. You're okay." Her eyes fluttered open, barely. "You're crying," she murmured. "Of course I am. You weren't supposed to cry. You weren't supposed to fall." She smiled weakly, then stopped, defying the rules. The storm above pulsed again, brighter than before, and in that instant her people witnessed something unimaginable. The queen bled, yet her storm still raged in the sky. It took 3 days to expel the invaders from orbit. 3 days of relentless counterattacks, of storm-born warriors fighting with a ferocity they had never displayed before. Their queen had fallen, but she had not perished, and that altered everything. Saraphene lived, broken but breathing. Carter never left her side. Not during the surgeries, not during the healing rituals, not even when the storm attempted to seize her mind in fevered dreams. He sat at her bedside while the rain whispered through the open windows. When she raged, he held her hand. When she wept, he let her. When she slept, he watched her chest rise and fall, a rhythm steadier than any thunder. On the 10th morning, she opened her eyes. "You stayed," she said, her voice a bare whisper. "I wasn't going anywhere." "I look different," she murmured, noticing the bandages, the scars. "You look like yourself," he replied. Finally, she reached for him, not with power, not with command, but with need, honest and raw. He took her hand. Together, they walked slowly onto the palace balcony, where thousands had gathered, uncertain if she would ever return. When they saw her leaning on a man with no crown, no title, only love in his eyes, the silence broke, not into applause, but into song. The ancient hymn of Varen, sung only for rulers who had died in glory, now offered to a queen who had survived with her heart intact. Saraphene stood before them, scarred but sovereign. She raised Carter's hand and said, without thunder, without command, "This is not my shadow, this is my equal." And the people, for the first time, did not bow from fear, they bowed from love. The wind above the citadel shifted, gentle now. A sky once dominated by storms welcomed light through its clouds. And Saraphene, the queen who was once untouchable, let herself be touched, not by fear, but by the man who never needed to conquer her to win her. And the world, in its own quiet way, changed with them.